deep conversations with Uli Baer on big ideas and great books. I'm thrilled to have a guest today, Ruby Lowe, who is actually on the call today with me from Melbourne, Australia. So Ruby is an author, an academic who received her PhD from NYU, working on John Milton, the poet and writer who we're going to talk about a bit today. And Ruby is currently the John Emmerson Fellow at the State Library of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia. So thanks, first of all, Ruby, for joining me on the Think About It podcast.
I'm thrilled to be here.
It's great. So I thought for our listeners, free speech has been a perennial topic of great interest on this podcast. I've done episodes with, the renowned Stanley Fish, who is a renowned Milton scholar and an expert on free speech, especially in the university, who wrote several very important books on Milton, and also a very well-known book called There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too, by which he understands some liberal pieties about free speech and sort of examines them without proposing what would be a better way of doing it. And you are a Milton scholar, and I thought we could start maybe by giving us a bit of a brief moment, although people, of course, can have this knowledge themselves or look this up, who John Milton was in the history of sort of world literature, let's say, sort of his status, really an incredibly important writer. And then we'll get to his text which discusses free speech. And one of the questions that the two of us had, and I'll get our listeners a kind of taste, that you sort of helped me understand, why do we call free speech and not, for example, freedom of expression or something like that? What does the speech part have to do in free speech? But if we start with Milton, maybe, and your interest in Milton, that would be really great, I think.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's really a great privilege for me to be here in this space speaking about freedom of speech. But yes, to Milton. So most people will know Milton as the author of Paradise Lost. Sometimes he gets given the title of the second most famous author in English after Shakespeare. But today, I really want to take us back to a kind of early Milton, and the Milton who was a pamphleteer, and then the Minister for Foreign Tongues in the revolutionary government, to think about how his political works really influenced his major poetry, and what relationship we can see between them. And we can see how Paradise Lost really picks up his early political work.
No, absolutely. So we're in the 1640s, and so before we get to Paradise Lost, which where Satan plays a hugely important role. Talk about a free speech proponent, right? So this is not what maybe in the 17th century people really expected from a pious work. And so tell me what he's doing in this small book or pamphlet called Areopagitica, which is modeled on a hill above the city of Athens, where people could presumably speak freely about matters of the state. So he's referring from the 17th century us back to Greek antiquity in the somewhat difficult title of that work.
Absolutely. So this is often what's referred to when we talk about Areopagitica, which is that place. And I want to get there in a second, but first I want to take us back to England, because I think one of the things that we do with Milton is we like to refer back to he's an incredible classicist, and we like to refer back to the classics. But I'm interested in his relationship to a much more popular English context, when people were really challenging what freedom of speech is in English. So just to sort of, refer back to what you were saying, in English, we talk about freedom of speech, right? As opposed to liberté d'expression in French, or in Italian, sometimes they use liberty of thought, sometimes they use expression. And so why is it in English we use this freedom of speech? And it has a very long history, which kind of sort of erupts in the 17th century. So at the time that Milton was writing, freedom of speech was the officially was the sole right of MPs. And MPs, when they were sitting inside the Houses of Parliament, and it was during a parliamentary session. And it was during the 1640s that the English structures of censorship fell apart. So the way in which works were censored was a very complicated process, but you had all of they were sort of overrun at this time. And all of a sudden you have a great flood of publications. So the kind of parliamentary speeches that were given inside of the House all of a sudden start getting printed en masse and distributed throughout England. And there's a lathe turner right out in the countryside who's writing in his diary what's happening in Parliament at this time. And we see people tracking, the public tracking what's occurring. And this is really not on, because what happens in Parliament should stay in Parliament. It's part of the kind of official dictates of freedom of speech. So the monarch at the opening of a parliamentary session allows the MPs to have this privilege, but the idea is that it should stay inside the doors. But there was a great public fervour for the news of Parliament. This is also the beginning of the wide distribution of parliamentary news books, which is the precursor to the newspaper in English. And it's sort of from this moment we also see sort of parliamentary speeches being stitched together and distributed.
No, just to give me a sense of where we are. So so members of Parliament have these vital discussions and debates about how best to govern the country, and the monarch gives them this right, and this is the space in which it is done, because it is done with the intent and the good faith that they're working out these issues, but there was no real conception, and then the printing press now exists, but there was no real conception that the public can sort of be addressed or hear these speeches all the time. So this is new. So it's sort of metaphorically, you're opening up Parliament to the lay public, as you're saying, people who are not really they're not elected, or they're not appointed, or they're not inherited into these titles. They're suddenly part of this debate.
Absolutely. So that there's this idea that the members of Parliament represent the public, and therefore they can engage in parliamentary debate, on behalf of them. So therefore it's not necessary that the people would have access to parliamentary debates. And also that this is before the formation of party politics, so that sort of inside the Houses of Parliament was really that limitation was about making sure that you didn't have the formation of parties at that time, so that you could. So MPs were even only allowed to speak inside the House during parliamentary sessions. Of course, this is just the official narrative about freedom of speech, and this is freedom of speech as an official right. In fact, you have a culture of kind of political debate and discussion in England, which is really very prevalent. And even in the kind of official narrative, you can see traces of that, or even more, overt examples. One that I really like is this idea, is a petition. The concept that a petition could be signed by thousands and thousands of people without freedom of speech is amazing. So what would happen is that that there would be this great deliberative process, right, and then it would be brought to the king. It would be brought to Parliament and to the king. And there's this one great pamphleteer who talks about this as a kind of, it's not really freedom of speech, it's more like a nerve conveying its pain to the head, a nerve in the foot conveying pain to the head. So that it's a very kind of elaborate narrative about about political debate in the society, but one which really privileges it inside the Houses of Parliament. And of course it's never, it's never a hermeneutically sealed space like that, that it doesn't work. And even in this time, but so during the flood of print, we can see in the print culture how fast it's moving through England. So you'd have news gatherers who would go in after parliamentary sessions and pick up speeches that people had dropped on the ground, and they were usually notes. And there's sort of there's many different ways of thinking about how how accurate these speeches are, and I think that the answer is that some of the ones that are distributed are highly accurate. They're even written by the speech of the MP themselves. Some of them are taken from notes of one's opponents. So there's a sort of, but it was also they were relatively cheap. Cheap to buy. Again, there's there's other members of the public who are writing in their diaries. Somebody admits to a sort of an addiction to these pamphlets. He says that I see them lying all over the house and I don't even know how they've stolen all my money. But it was relative, it for the public now had a kind of steady stream of information coming from Parliament. And we're getting to Milton in a moment. But
but this is actually really important. And what is happening, what you're describing, this is sort of happening without anybody having made a decision one day that from today on, we have this sort of sealed Parliament as a kind of, sanctified space for this kind of political debate. And now it's all out in the public. You're saying there's a process and there's many different dimensions to it. And this happens in this period, right? The 1630s and 40s or so?
Yeah, the 1640s. So that you have the collapse of censorship in 1641 or 1642. And it said that, in fact, many of the apprentices take over the print shops and they're using all of the resources. So you have, this is a moment where long codices, like long books, stop being published. And instead you have many short pamphlets. And there's one scholar, Zaret, who argues that this imposed a kind of dialogic order on Parliament because you have all of these pamphlets that are kind of coming out of Parliament, but all of a sudden, and this is the really exciting moment for me, is when you get non-office bearers, so non-MPs writing their own parliamentary speeches. So not only are people sort of reading what's happening and even following the characters of different MPs, their own MPs, different MPs, and the debates that are occurring in Parliament. You would often buy news books, which would give the summary of the debates, and sometimes they'd even have the timetables of when things were being debated in Parliament. So it's really a kind of virtual relation to what's occurring inside of the House. But all of a sudden, 1644, you get George Wither writing a speech back to Parliament, and it's called, his pamphlet is called The Speech Without Door, which I love because without door means outside of the door. So he takes this kind of his point of exclusion from Parliament, and he turns it into the possibility of creating a space. There are he actually takes the name, The Speech Without Doors, from a slightly earlier moment of manuscript. So print, I'm very interested in this print moment, but there is actually a manuscript backstory to this. And it was when people would write people did write letters to Parliament, but George Wither turned it into a speech, into a parliamentary speech, and he was arguing for a kind of parity. He was saying, I am as important as those inside of the house, as those inside the house. Yeah.
That seems incredibly radical to say that, to publish something and say, my speech is of equal importance as your speech and your job. You have been appointed to actually carry out the speech on behalf of the state, etc. So that's a radical thing to say. My speech outside of doors is equally valid, or it needs a response, or what does this demand? What does he want? He wants this to become a position in Parliament that is then debated.
So let me, I actually have a quote that I want to read because I think it's really important to kind of really sketch this out properly. So he says, I am not of the representative body of this kingdom. I am a member of the body represented. I find this absolutely beautiful. I am a member of the body represented. And then he says, to whom, when the well-being of it is concerned, there belongs times and places and privileges of speaking. So, he sort of inverts it, the chiasmus, and he says, I'm not an MP, but I'm represented. And because, so he's really issuing a state of emergency. And I've had arguments with lots of people about this, because there's that he's issuing a state of exception and a democratic state of exception, in the sense that he's saying, when I'm not being fully represented, I therefore have the right. And we see this not as because usually states of exception and political exception come from above, where the monarch or the ruling body will seize things and say that the law no longer applies.
Right.
But here it's really a democratic form, where he's saying you're not representing me, so therefore I can.
And so you've talked about this with other people. What is the disagreement? Whether this is a suspension of democratic processes, or is this an assertion of his democratic right? Like, what's the dispute, or what's the debate you have with other people about this? What's the status of this speech?
Yeah, that it's in fact not legal.
Okay.
What he's doing. And so when he says it's very beautiful, his pamphlet, he says, I'm outside of the door and I have an audience here with me outside of the doors. And he's basically saying we've passed it into legislation because it's a sort of, he's making a competitive representative.
Yeah.
But I find this fascinating though, because he's basically saying it's only in states of emergency.
Yeah.
That we really that everybody in the public has the right to freedom of speech, and to come here outside the doors of Parliament and and have this place, this space to address the public. But it's in fact John Milton who takes up this pamphlet. So just a couple of months later, he publishes Areopagitica, and it takes many of its cues from George Wither's Speech Without Doors. And in one sense, he uses this kind of great classical reference of the Areopagus, but then he also intermingles this with this very, very British practice of printing parliamentary speeches that's sort of occurring at the time. And what he does is that he's unlike George Wither, who really thinks it should just be in an emergency. John Milton feels that it's really that it's a democratic right, that it's about, yes, are there limitations on it? Of course. However, he believes that that there should be the possibility of open speaking and open reading in the society. That's his that's his position. And again, there's lots of debates over the reference of what does the Areopagus really mean, how does it function in his work, and I think it works on a number of different levels. He's flattering Parliament by referring to them as this great Greek entity.
So let's go to this moment here.
Yeah.
So he's flattering the people in power in a pamphlet that's a pretty severe critique of their current practice, but he's starting out by saying, I'm going to set you on the level of the Greek polis, of the most probably respected statesmen, and I'm going to give it this title that you all know, that this is actually, I'm locating you on the level of what we assume is the height of civilization. So I'm not starting out a polemic to say, you have fallen in your obligation, you're beneath this. In some ways, I'm going to criticize you, call you out, but rather you are at the highest level, and I'm going to put you at this level, and I'm going to teach you what it means to be at that level. So rhetorically, it's not just dumb flattery, but it's really quite brilliant, because initially it's very erudite, it's very learned. It's not something I had to look up a lot of things because I didn't go to a good British school like that. But all the references are meant to make them feel we are living up to a kind of eternal standard that's predates us by a lot, right? That's the flattery part, and that's why he gives us this kind of lofty Greek title.
Absolutely. Yes, but what he's doing by referring to them as that is that he's turning, instead of Parliament having the sole right of freedom of speech and freedom of debate, he's saying that they should oversee the freedom of speech within the society, which was historically their role. So he's making a very complicated switch with the title. So yes, do they have an opportunity to censor some texts? For sure. However, in doing this, he's really swapping the kind of privileges and extending the privilege out to the society with that reference. And I think a lot of people are really interested in the limitations in Areopagitica on freedom of speech, and also interested in Milton, because Milton in turn becomes the censor during the revolutionary government, and people see this as a very contradictory part of his argument.
I think we'll get we'll get there in a moment, sort of what is the sort of today's sort of what people take up. But I think to sort of give some space, maybe if you can, to what the text says, first of all, about why freedom of speech is an important thing. And it's quite moving and actually incredibly great passages, some of whom are so famous. One of them is engraved above the reading room at the New York Public Library quite famously. A lot of them are quoted all the time. And before we get to the contradiction, or is there, does he ultimately allow for a limitation, he actually puts something into circulation that a lot of people, I think, kind of take for granted, that free speech is vitally important for human sort of flourishing, not just in this political moment, not just in that one in Greece, not done in this one in 1640s England. It is actually has something to do with what we are as human beings. And I think this part is so powerful. That's why the text still stays relevant and people quote it and then they say, oh, there's a contradiction somewhere. But he actually opens up something outside of these specific debates, right? So from the earlier the speech outside the door, he goes into a much more general, it's like an explanation of speech. It's not a defense even. He doesn't, it's not even a defense. I think it's much deeper than a defense, than it's kind of, than a reactive defense. Free speech is good. Like he says, why, what is good about it? What does it do? How does it work?
Oh, what a beautiful question. Milton believes that free speech trains us as not only good thinkers and good readers, but also as good people. He believes that it's necessary to learn any kind of ethics. He believes that it's necessary for the governance of the society. He believes that it's very, he's at the very heart of a human freedom. And I do want to read a couple of those really beautiful quotes because I think that they're worth hearing once more again. As he says, it was from out the rind of one apple tasted that the knowledge of good and evil as two twins cleaving together leapt forth into the world. And perhaps that is to say doom which Adam fell into knowing good and evil, that is to say of knowing good by evil. And therefore the state of man now is that wisdom can there be to choose and what conscience to forbear without the knowledge of evil. So he says, so what he says is that we wouldn't know without reading, we know neither good nor evil because they came as twins together. They came as twins together in the world. So therefore to have any possibility or any moral outlook whatsoever, one is trained in reading. And he says, as I don't believe in a cloistered virtue, right? So one that sort of stays back, sort of stays within doors, to use that metaphor again. But what rather he says is that we need to be in the race and we need to be dirty and sullied in order to be good citizens.
Okay.
Yo, pass me my Biggie shades. We need some Versace in here. Life is better in Biggies.
Nurses, are you tired of spending weeks or even months finding the perfect job that matches your specialty with your ideal shift and salary? LinkedIn has improved your job search experience. Search by specialty, the shift you want to work, and the salary you want to make. Go to linkedin.com/nurses and begin searching today. That's linkedin.com/nurses.
Note, side effects may include less time finding the perfect job, working a shift that you love with a salary that can take you to St. Thomas, Jamaica, and continuous smiling because of how simple this process was.
And it's a very moving account of humanity. Is a very dynamic thing. There is no such thing as our essence is this or that, or we get corrupted, or he says at some point, childhood, which is often a metaphor for people who are uncorrupted, he says it's an empty virtue. It's not pure. He says we gain purity by choosing good over and weeding out evil. He said, actually, it's quite brilliant. He said, we're not a blank slate. We're not children. That is an emptiness or naivete. And actually, by being given the choice, he says at some point, we do not, why did God put into the garden of evil temptation, and why does he put pleasures in front of us and vices? To let us choose, and reasoning is choosing. And it's this very dynamic idea of the human as a being that evolves and through choices becomes what we are. And what you said, that it's the rind of one apple that teaches us that there's good and there's evil. If we didn't know the other, it would be this kind of emptiness we would dwell in. There would be no differentiation. So it's, and you said right now in this beautiful quote, it teaches us about good and evil. So it's a kind of morality we are taught. It also teaches us that we can choose, that reasoning allows us to choose between different things. And that is more intellectual, because the first part, let's say, is about morality. And then he goes to this idea of truth. And
yes,
maybe we can get to that, because there's also this kind of idea that there are things in the world and we can make choices. In the world we live in today, we're now flooded with information, and people say, how do I decide what to believe, and what's opinion, what's truth, what's falsehood, what lies? Like Milton says something quite specific. It's really beautiful, I think, about how we learn to reason, and reason is choosing between different options, let's say. Like there's this quote that you probably have it on your list as well. So it's one of the, things that probably people quote quite a lot. And it says, though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength, to misdoubt the strengths of truth. Let her and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. People have read this in several ways, and some people say, oh, well, therefore, let the floodgates be open and let lies and truth kind of grapple, he says, in a free and open encounter. But it's a very beautiful quote. He says, let truth be in the field, and we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. We actually distrust truth by regulating it in a way. And then he says, let her and falsehood grapple in a free and open encounter. That, to me, as a modern critic, and like I would be curious what you say, I would hear in a free and open encounter, well, what does free and open encounter actually mean? When he has just said there's no empty space in the world, that the world is given to us and we make it into what it is. What would a totally free and open encounter be of truth and falsehood?
I mean, I think he believes that it's a debate in the society, and he believes that we should give truth an opportunity to fight it out, and otherwise we make ourselves a really a weak society, weak subjects and weak society, weak and he believes that we need to give truth sort of the time to hold, and the public space to hold this kind of he calls it a race. So he believes that we need this time, that we have this time, on earth, and a specific set time in order to let truth be exercised.
Give me a little bit more of the context. So when he's saying this, how do you think it is received when he writes this? And he said, basically, if I can paraphrase this a little bit, so let truth be out there and let it do its thing. And, we should not misdoubt or doubt her strength. And let's hope for the best. Truth will win out. I think that's the assumption, right? Like that these sort of things, truth will win out, because he lives in a world where things are very regulated from
Absolutely. Absolutely. And he feels that, in fact, the loosening of censorship in the society was the moment that he calls it, that you get a great crop of knowledge. And he continues to use all of the many agrarian metaphors here, that you have this sprouting of new forms, and that to impose censorship is to prohibit truth and really prohibit the discovery of new forms of knowledge. And he's writing this right at the end, when they're just about to reimpose the sort of censorship processes, and that really comes, in fact, from the stationers, the publishers, because they no longer have a monopoly on publishing, and they come to Parliament and they're asking Parliament to sort of reinstate reinstate the processes. But he believes it's during this moment of open publication that you get the greatest sort of combat between truth and falsehood, which he sees as not only deeply productive, but also he sees it as a distinct, as distinctly Christian also.
And it's in some ways when he writes, like as you said, he writes Paradise Lost later on and makes Satan into one of the major protagonists in some ways. So do you think this is connected to saying truth has to be in the world and seduction, or whatever Satan stands for, all these other things have to be in the world as well? He gives us a work where you're grappling, there are huge debates between God and Satan and all these different things. It is like staged as if it's a kind of, like it's itself a kind of epic that contains debates within it.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that Milton really, that's such a beautiful question. Thank you. That like one of the things that Milton really gets from this period is how much you have to listen to your adversary. So that in order to sell pamphlets, because that was, a significant part of this process of the boom or the flood of print publication, you actually needed to think about your opponent's argument and incorporate it into your text. And Milton does this beautifully in Areopagitica, in a sort of reductio ad absurdum. Is that what he does? Is he takes the licenser's position and it sort of seems relatively reasonable, and then he blows it completely out of proportion, and he says, well, if you're going to bring in one licensor to license all of the books, then what else needs to be licensed in the society? And he says, well, then if we're going to license the books, then we're going to need to license all of the violins, and we're going to need to license all of the kind of movements and all of the songs and all of the dances in the society, anything that could be considered speech. So here we have the kind of blowing out of that medium and his understanding that freedom of speech really means all of these different parts of the society, and he brings that in when he's taking on the voice of the censor, because in Areopagitica he makes this sort of argument that it's and he makes it again and again, that freedom of speech, that the sort of limitations on freedom of speech is not only impossible. He has a beautiful metaphor. It's like locking up the gates of a park to keep the pigeons in, but it's also immoral, because because without it we don't get the emergence of this sort of sweaty truth who's racing for that immortal garland. But I see this process of the sort of imitation of the adversary as incredibly significant, and it's really not only in Areopagitica, it's in this kind of moment of print culture very broadly, is a close listening and articulation of the other's argument, because in order to get your reader on board for a parliamentary speech or a kind of one of these sort of parliamentary, and it's very important that this speech, that Areopagitica is a speech, and George Withers, the speech without door, these were speeches written to Parliament, but that they were not petitions in any easy sense, or because they were not simply delivered to Parliament for Parliament's debate, although it's very likely, and we know that many MPs did read these works. Really, they were addressing the nation through the Parliament. So you have this kind of double address that's occurring. But in order to sort of hold one of these addresses together, you need to be able to hold the position of your opponent within your work, so that you're holding a much more kind of a live debate. And even though these works are very kind of, a lot of them are only a couple of pages long, even a lot of it is dedicated to address, many of them are dedicated to addressing the opponent in that work. And I think this is significant because it's a real, in order to properly address one's opponent, you need to become them. And I think, and we see that in, Milton's Reductio ad Absurdum. He becomes a licenser and thinks what it would be like to license everything in the society. But we do see this on a much bigger scale, as you say, in Paradise Lost. And readers, there's a sort of famous idea that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, this sort of Blakean idea that somehow he was more committed to the position of Satan than he was to the position of God, and famously that all of God's speeches are terribly boring, and all of Satan, all of Satan's are much more seductive. And I think that this is an extension of Milton's experience of print culture, which was to bring people in with the other's argument, and the necessity of incorporating that argument into oneself, and incorporating what is devilish into his own work.
Can I stay for a moment with this idea? So when he is kind of saying, I'm going to just play this out right now, so you hire these censors who are going to look at these texts and sort of decide what the public can see or not. And then he says, as you said, this kind of argument ad absurdum. He says, what would that really entail? He said, first of all, it would be so many people reading so many books day and night all the time. They'd have to be very sophisticated, smart readers. Most people of such intelligence would just hate such a job to just keep reading for what can't be printed. Secondly, he said, then, as you said, it would touch all of human experience. It would be in people's homes. You would have to actually interdict or prohibit music, playing, chatter. You cannot regulate in a way what people are. It goes far beyond what you think you're regulating. You're touching on a little tiny thing. It's an iceberg behind it. So he says, I'll go with your argument for a moment, and I'll show you how it's undoable. It's just impractical undoable. It also touches on the nature of human beings. He said, I actually like that when he said these censors wouldn't want to do it. They would just be beyond miserable to do it, because you have to hire. It's like hiring a lot of really intelligent people to comb the internet for hateful content. Like that would be a terrible job. But they say you have to, for a moment, assume the other position, and you have to assume it without having already judged it as morally wrong or flawed, or you can't do it, impractical. And isn't this argument that comes later, what you said about Paradise Lost, that readers have said he likes Satan more than God, or he makes Satan into a more likable character, very different points. Either he is on the side of Satan, or as a writer, he makes you think Satan is the more attractive protagonist. Do you think there's a problem with that, or is there a limit to that? Because we live in this world today where sometimes people say, oh, you have to understand the other side, and you have to sort of really go there and sort of grapple with all these ideas. And some people say, I don't want to have that in my mind. I don't have maybe the strength of a Milton to sort of have all these ideas and then write an amazing work and stage these voices in my head and externalize them again. They'll corrupt me. They'll be in me. They'll inhabit me. You know what I mean? There's a kind of
Yeah, I mean, so in Areopagitica, he says, we read to see and know and yet abstain. So he sees. Say this
again. Yeah.
He says to see and to know and yet abstain. And it's a very complicated idea because, with all of the complexity of what knowing might mean, what does it mean to know something? But he believes that that it's through this process of holding these different positions in one's mind that one does become more competent. And I think that's, if you were to say to people, no, I don't want to, I can't, I can't possibly think about the other, it will corrupt me, it will do all of these things, is that I think that Milton, Milton was a teacher. Milton was he worked in the government, and he did many, many different things. But he believed that it was through reading that people would become stronger, that it's not just automatically that we have a capacity to do this, that it's, And I really agree with the distinction that you made in terms of in Paradise Lost, of whether one is making God more making the devil more seductive than God, and whether one is on the devil or God's side. I think that that's an important distinction. However, I also really feel that Milton was genuinely voicing voicing these positions and giving his reader an opportunity to engage with them rather than dominate, rather than telling the reader exactly what they should feel. So it's in fact, and as you already pointed that out, that it's a kind of condescension to the reader to believe that the morality of the text is somehow in his moral position. What he's doing is allowing these voices to be heard, and because of his background in the civil wars and because of his experience of the limitations on freedom of speech. So this is, we're talking, we've spent a lot of time now thinking about the kind of great boom in print publication, and we have, truth running around in the society because there's so much great print culture going on. However, much of Milton's time, and even during the Revolution and the Republic, there was great sort of clamping down on freedom of speech. Comes 1660, Charles II's first act was the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, and it's got this incredibly sort of poetic title. The idea is that everybody in the society could go free, with the exception of the regicides, those that signed the death warrant of Charles I, who were all hung, drawn and quartered, and famously even Cromwell, who was dead, and he was exhumed, hung, drawn and quartered, his head put on London Bridge. But the deal is that apart from those people who had to be punished, everybody else could so-called go free, so long as they never spoke about the events of the English Revolution and Republic. And this was...
Hey, Crystal Rosas here. I'm always hunting for my next fitness obsession, and I just found it. F45 Training. F45 Training? It's so different. It's a place where everyone's welcome, no matter where you are in your fitness journey. Plus, you get to keep fit with the team. So you've got people cheering you on and keeping you motivated. To try 5 classes for just $49. Visit F45NYC.com. F45 Training. Change your life in just 45 minutes.
Just stay with this for a moment. I know this episode really only, with my really completely inadequate knowledge of British history, but just to recap that moment right now. So Charles II is now king. Charles I has been executed by, let's say, his people. And tell us what this edict is there. What does Charles II decide? How can people go on? Like, it's just an amazing moment of having to do with the authority to control what history is remembered. So just to recap that again, it is so fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so, thank you.
It's just an amazing moment. And I wish I'd learned this more in high school or college, but that's why I have a podcast, so I can learn these things.
Yeah, there's reasons I didn't learn this in high school either. And for what I'm just about to go over, I think that the sort of the reasons become clear of why we didn't get to learn these things at high school. So, Charles I, he was tried by Parliament and executed, and then Milton defended the execution of Charles I, not by saying that the execution itself was valid, but that the people had the right to execute, had the right to execute their monarch if he'd behaved in a tyrannical way. Famously, he's called by Engels, he's called the first defender of the revolution for this tract. After you have the Revolution and the Republic, Charles II, so the son of Charles I, who escapes England dressed as a maid, he's and hides in a royal oak. He comes back with significant support and is reinstated as the king in 1660.
There's a time period in between. So the execution of the king under the order of Parliament, and then there's an interregnum. There's a period. The
interregnum period, but even this idea of the interregnum is between reigns, and so I'm always very interested when people talk about it as the interregnum. So as opposed to to discussing it as the English Revolution and the English Republic, we have this kind of cleaned from English history, as opposed to if you think about a French history. And think about a French, a French Republic or a French Revolution. I can even see in people's faces sometimes when I talk about it, they're like, Which English Revolution?
Right.
And part of the reason we don't know about it is the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion. So Charles II's first act, which was really a deal. It was, we can, no one will be, nobody will be punished for this, for their participation in the revolution, except the regicides. And then you can be punished for bringing it back into memory. But part of this document that I've sort of read lots and lots of times and I'm fascinated by is that it says, they say we want to bury the seeds of discourse. Of discord, not discourse. Well, funnily enough, of discord. We want to bury the seeds of discourse. So it's saying we want to move on, right? But it's a really strange metaphor to bury the seeds of discord, because what happens when you bury seeds, right? Is that
the bad metaphor.
Exactly.
You want to actually let them dry in the sun and on a hard surface. But okay.
Don't burn the seed. There are many things that. But then I think that this really goes back to Milton's point. And sometimes I wonder whether they've read Areopagitica too many times, and that you have the kind of this flowery crop of knowledge, which Milton loves to talk about, that happened after the collapse of censorship. Anyway, but to get back, the purpose, although we can see that there's absolutely a transfer of not all of the knowledge that was produced during this time into English society, a lot of the kind of experimentalism in terms of religion and science and all of these different things gets taken up in the society. Much is transferred, much of the sort of the beginning, the sort of democratic practices that were happening in this moment then move on into restoration culture. But the official narrative is that there's silence, that there's oblivion, where there was revolution and oblivion. And it's really the work of scholars such as David Norbrook, who wrote about this and brought it even into a scholarly discussion, to say that in fact it's not only this revolutionary moment that was erased, and it's not even the English Republic which was erased, but a much longer history of dissent that we can hear in Shakespeare and we can hear in English literature, and that Milton's this really important figure because for some reason, despite all of his revolutionary activity, despite his and all of his the texts that he published, the pamphlets that he published, and Paradise Lost, he is allowed to be the one sort of major Republican figure in the English canon of literature, in the English literary canon. However, a lot of people have argued that he should be taken out. Like T.S. Eliot was like, no, his Latinate sentences means that he should be taken out. And yet we sort of still have him there as a kind of, way of remembering and a way of re-entering this really important political moment.
And the moment is, just to stay for a moment, it's just an amazing moment. So the ruler of a country says, we're going to make a deal for society to move forward. A few people will be punished severely, even Milton the Great, because they were really the criminals. Everybody else, we just won't talk about it. And it was a parliamentary decision. His father was executed by lawfully, etc. So we just won't talk about it. And I'm really interested in this, that sort of there's a repression of speech in the name of social harmony and moving forward, and that a historical event will be repressed deliberately, will be forbidden, you'll be punishable by law to talk about it because it'll disrupt it. And I teach a whole different set of things in my classes, and I've taught quite a bit sort of the thinking, which reminds me of this behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa in the 1990s, where they said, we cannot move forward unless we address this. There was no edict to forget the past, but we're going to have this public hearing. It'll be very traumatic. It'll clear the air, though, and then we can move forward. But we cannot keep on being dragged back into the past. You have another example, and I'm using analogies that would deserve so much more sort of nuance, but the current government of the People's Republic of China doesn't allow publications about Tiananmen Square, about June 4th, 1989, about the student protests on that. It just doesn't exist in official Chinese discourse. And they're saying in the name of social harmony. They're not saying in the name of sort of what you're saying, burying the seed of discord, because it will actually threaten the social good. So sometimes forgetting is kind of ordered. So it's an amazing moment. And he says Milton kind of gets through this. He's not put on the side of the people really responsible, and he's put inside everybody can move forward and move on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he does go to jail. And Andrew Marvell, who the poet Andrew Marvell, actually, who is his secretary during the Revolution, the Republic, he goes to Parliament, and also Marvell is an MP, and he goes to Parliament and he gets Milton, famously he gets Milton, he argues for Milton to be, but yes, by all accounts, Milton lives, and more than lives. He, publishes Paradise Lost in 1667, and the question scholars have been asking for a long time is how can we understand his revolutionary politics within this work? And I really, I believe that it's in this culture of debate that we can hear inside of Paradise Lost, which he's arguing for in Areopagitica all throughout his prose, is this kind of is the possibility for an open debate.
And you're saying that, so you can read both Paradise Lost as this, epic on questions that are sort of questions of Christianity, faith, but then you're saying, but the way it's done is actually taking something out of what he's learned from this culture of debate, and that you take the position of the adversary, maybe you leave it ad absurdum, but you actually engage with it very deeply, you endow it with, or you allow it all of its rhetorical strength, you don't just ridicule it or diminish it. You're saying it becomes such an important work partly because it picks up what's in the society and culture around him, in which he was a major voice 20 years before, because he publishes this pamphlet for free speech.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the ways that doesn't work is if you try and say, well, God is the king, or Satan is, or Satan is, using a language of tyranny, which he really does, and we know that this was very special to Milton. So why all of a sudden do you have the adversary using the language of tyranny? So that doesn't work, and it just that kind of analogy, political analogy, doesn't work. So the question becomes, as you said, how then do we read his politics? And I think, to me, when I read Paradise Lost, I feel I can hear all of these closed debates in the society that all of a sudden we get access to as the reader, and being given access to them, we're all of a sudden allowed a kind of participation in them. And there's many, many different kinds of debates that are occurring in Paradise Lost. And I mean, just to give a kind of quick overview of those, that would be, we see God really wait for the Son to self-appoint himself to go and save mankind. And then we get to see these amazing, which everybody loves, is the debates in hell, between the devils. And there was actually this was a genre of pamphlets during the Revolution, which was parliamentary hell. Debates occurring in hell, and they cast all of the MPs. Also fabulously, just outside of the houses of the Lords and Commons, there was 2 pubs in the Civil Wars, and one of them was called Heaven and the other one was called Hell. So we have this kind of live parliamentary culture, which we see, which we can then see inside the epic. So, all of a sudden you get to sort of hear the Son and God talking. You get to hear, you get to overhear all of the, I believe, in the kind of hell parts of the debate, you get to hear really the possibilities of the revolutionaries, but also the pitfalls and the narcissism of them, and a great critique of revolutionary desire. But beyond that, you do get to hear it, which is so significant in a society in which it has been officially silenced,
Right.
that you get the voicing of these positions. So, I mean, it's not as if Milton was exactly going to have God talking about tyranny. And it was, this is a poem, and I think we need to read it as a poem. And he's asking us to read these different positions. But it's not only in the sort of, in heaven and hell. I think that there's a real culture of debate and exchange on earth that you have between, incredible discussions about astronomy and theology, between the angels and Adam. And then you get all of the fabulous debates themselves between the first parents. So we get this kind of look into, when Eve says, I think we should labour separately. And of course, this sort of leads to the fall of man, no less. However, we get to see that kind of moment of her splitting off from Adam, and it's a complicated moment because, of course, you don't get you don't get knowledge without this moment, without the kind of the tasting of that apple to return to. To return to the Areopagitica reference that we see it explored, dramatized, and explored here.
And tell me something about how this work, Paradise Lost, how do you think it's viewed not in a specialized academic context, but generally in some ways? If you said you didn't learn in high school about the period of the revolution, which is called the interregnum normally, which makes it look like it's a blip, it's a parenthesis, it's a bracket, and then normalcy is restored or something, and you learn all the kings and queens, and you say, oh, well, there was a moment, bit of a couple of years in between. So what's the status of Paradise Lost for sort of, let's say, sort of more generally British self-understanding or in the canon? What is it? Is it just considered, oh, it's a big epic, an allegory of the Bible, or how do people read it? And, I'm going to give you like another sort of part of this question. The way in which I was taught Shakespeare, sort of from like high school into college, and then I was very fortunate, like one of my teachers was Harold Bloom, who sort of said Shakespeare is the invention of the human, and what he really meant it is the invention of us overhearing ourselves think and becoming aware of ourselves, and sort of the invention of the modern subject is we're sort of a self-conscious to a fault. Hamlet is really self-conscious, paralyzed. Other people, Rosamund or something, is self-conscious in a good way. Othello is corrupted, like all these things. But these are sort of things that resonate with us. And he turned Shakespeare not into a historical playwright, but sort of he's the playwright who gives us the dimensions of our psyche or something like that, like the invention of the human, as he called it. And people have read it differently. But that's how I felt Shakespeare comes to us and say, well, you don't learn about English history. It doesn't really matter. You don't learn about ancient history. You just learn about being human. Paradise Lost seems at a bit of a remove because you see Adam, Eve, Satan. You're like, how can I connect to this?
I think it's really, it's such an important point to discuss because we're given in high school, at university, we're given an opportunity to really, and we're offered to read Shakespeare how we want to read him in terms of, in terms of sort of being human, where you could say we're given a great access to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare sort of saturates our culture in many different ways, and whether, however, Milton really is held at arm's length, and there's many, for the reasons that we've been talking about, there's many political reasons historically for that. And I think that this is it's a complicated way of really engendering a political program through a British education system that I definitely think extends out to, Australia in magnificent ways and very complicated ways. However, I believe that we need to be given a kind of permission then to read Milton, and I think that that's changing slightly now. So Orlando Reed, who is a graduate student at Princeton when I was at NYU, and we ran a few projects together. He's just published a book called What is Dark Within Me that looks at the kind of revolutionary afterlives of Paradise Lost. And I think that what he's doing in that book is giving people access not only to read Milton, but to misread Milton. And this is itself a very Miltonic idea, that you can take something from it, that you can, the process of digestion is a process of selecting what you want from a work. So I see that we're actually really in a moment of change where, and I believe that people will start to see, because of Milton's politics, what an important sort of figure he is, and then and use him to think through some of these human problems and human possibilities that we've often just turned to Shakespeare for.
I want to sort of go back to one question about religion, and in a different way. I know that Stanley Fish said at some point the only way to really get to Milton is through his theology. Otherwise, you don't really get it. But that's fine for a Milton scholar. And Stanley Fish would say, I'm only talking about a specific Milton, which is the poet, and that's the access. And he would say, and you can do all sorts of other things with all the other Milton texts, and especially the Areopagitica, which is a more political text. And in that text, I'll read you a quote about conscience. And I'm kind of interested, is this a kind of that he has a Christian belief that is available to lots of people today, but possibly fewer people or secular readers would be like, how do I manage this? Because this quote is a very short quote. Above all other liberties, give me the freedom to know, to speak, and to argue openly and honestly according to my conscience. And according to my conscience, is that a simple way of saying, according to the fact that there is a truth that has been scattered since the death of Christ and can be reassembled. And this is a way to think about that we don't have as a secular, as a secular society, we don't have sort of seeking a truth that could be reassembled after it's been scattered. We just live in a disenchanted world after, sort of the death of God, which Nietzsche called an event in the history of mankind, something like that. That is the religious part of Milton, the thing that allows him to advocate for hearing your adversary, really engaging with them, allowing, what does he say against truth, allowing falsehood and truth to grapple, allowing falsehood to flourish, because ultimately something will win out. Is the faith not just, I faith the truth will win out, but I have faith, and it's Christian faith, and therefore the truth shall win out. Truth shall overcome. So I just don't know whether the religious part, whether I'm just trying to be correct enough not to turn Milton into a kind of secular proponent of free speech with some contradictions in it and missing that other part.
That's such a
well, it's probably unanswered.
No, it's such a really profound and important question. And I think the first thing to say is that scholars have used Milton's theology as a way of preventing people from reading Milton.
Here's a note to Stanley Fish. Okay, so Stanley, who's a great polemicist and who will be happy to engage with you on this, so we'll bring him on the podcast again.
Absolutely, I would love that. So it's a way of saying you can't read this unless you have Milton's theology, and how unless you've read all of his Christian tracts, unless you've read all of his work, therefore you can't read his poem. And people do this a lot with lots of different things in Milton studies. So if you say, unless you speak Hebrew and Greek and Italian and French, you also can't understand Milton. So that there's a very one of the things that Milton scholarship has done is put him, is hidden him inside of the academy. Of course, there's been breaks in this historically. Orlando, who I just referred to, his great new book. There's that.
But I want to say it's funny, this gatekeeping about the man who said free speech is the most important thing, right? This is available to anyone. We all have access to it. And then people gatekeep Milton to say, well, you have to be really, really sophisticated, go to school for a long time, and you'll probably never reach that level.
Exactly. That he, and then there's this amazing work about, called Of Education, where Milton cites all of the, it's really a syllabus that he that you should follow. And then people say, well, unless you've read all of these, unless you've mastered all of this material, you can't read Milton. And as you say, it's a really perverse, thing to do with Paradise Lost. But I think that that's not I think that Milton believed that you could read partially, and I think that those, if he really thought that you had to be Milton to to read Milton, which is, I think, mainly what Milton scholars think, then nobody would be reading Milton. And we can see even like after Paradise Lost, he moves in, and mainly because there's many critiques of Paradise Lost for its difficulty, he moves into a much plainer style. So after Paradise Lost, there's his major works are Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes. And Samson Agonistes is a very much more straightforward text to read. And I think that that's because, there's a number of reasons for that. It's based on a kind of pamphlet play during the Civil Wars. There was sort of royalist form of the pamphlet plays, and he does many different things with it. But I think we can see him sort of, really changing his language. He never stops using the classical references, which also people say, well, unless you're a great classicist, you can't read Milton. He still uses those. We have but again, he's interested in this kind of movement incorporation of popular material and intermixing it with classical material. But I think that that's what we can hear, when we can hear, and some of indeed the most sort of accessible parts of the work, such as the Satan, really come from, or as the adversary, which come from the kind of adversarial print culture. I think if you zone in on those parts, they really are the readable parts. I mean, for example, Adam asks a lot of very, you could even call them naive questions of the angels. For example, he asks if they, we get to hear that angels, they eat food, they have sex, they do all of these different things. So I think that there's a lot of parts of Paradise Lost which we often don't, which we don't get to hear, which we don't get to hear about because the theology has come down. But I think that in fact, it was an introduction to those questions of theology. It was an opening the doors to, that we get much more fleshed out characters in Paradise Lost than we do in the Bible. So much so that often students think that what's in what's in Paradise Lost is in the Bible, but that isn't that's today. But also, like, historically, there's been those kind of mistakes because Milton really captured people's imaginary, and in his experimentation with this biblical text. And I really believe that that's what it is. I think that we can't say that even what's in Milton's theological works is what's in Paradise Lost, because I believe that it's an experiment. And I mean experiment in a kind of true, in a sort of experimental philosophy sort of sense, that he was looking to experiment with what, with the material there, and literature was his tool to do that.
And if we go back and to the Areopagitica, do you think this idea that, give me the freedom to know, to speak, and to argue openly, do you think this is recommendation? It has been really sort of cited so much, it's kind of celebrated by all sorts of people who I've engaged with on this podcast quite a bit, sort of, who are free speech absolutists and say yes, and then the qualifier then he says, according to my conscience, meaning this kind of exercise, freedom to know, speak, and argue openly and honestly, according to my conscience, it seems to qualify it in a good way, saying what we would today say in good faith, or with an awareness that there's intention to this. Like, I've always sort of, in some ways, I'm just curious what you think, whether Milton allows for this openness, this what you call the speech without doors, sort of, that he takes much further than the original publication with that name. And yet says, but I will be capable of doing this because I will ultimately know what's good or evil, or what's right. Like, there's a conscience at play, there's something at play here. Whereas today, I'm not so sure people know these things about themselves. Not that they're not Milton, but whether there's this, it's kind of invisibly held together by that assumption that according to my conscience, that's like an appeal or something like that, or a call to us. Say, so don't use this text to say, oh, let's loosen the floodgates of speech and it'll be good for everybody. Say, according to my conscience, there are these kind of markers in the text that say, this is for the good of yourself and for humanity.
Yeah, I think that Milton absolutely, and many, and the radicals which he drew upon their work believed that there was that they were following their consciences, but also that this had a relationship to the rest of the society. And one of the ways that this relationship was conceived, if we go back to that kind of George Wither quote, which I was talking at the beginning, was thinking about how you're part of a body with other people. And yes, this is a Christian reference, and it goes back to this idea of a Christian corporation. So it's very Christian in that sense, that you're engaging in a public body with other people. So it's not a kind of I don't believe that this is a singular or a private conscience. I believe that this is a public one. And it was and when they talk about their conscience, it is the public conscience in which they are participating. So it's not the kind of self-interest, I do not believe it's the sort of limited self-interest or individualist conscience that we might be referring to today. And it's that this idea of the kind of the health of the public is taken very seriously. And really, to come back to what I've been saying, I think that it's about how if you wanted to be a representative of the people, you had to represent all of the views within your position. There's many sort of textual experiments with this kind of idea of incorporation in at this moment. One of the sort of famous 16th century ones are the Martin Marprelate pamphlets, and I love them because they engage in a kind of political representation through different voices. So you have different voices in one tract. So you have people sort of upper class accents and lower class accents coming together to show that a single text could represent could be a representative text, and therefore challenge those in power. So you have these radical print experiments with what incorporation meant, and with what conscience meant as a public activity and as a communal activity rather than a single one.
That's so helpful. That's really, really helpful too. That I sort of read this too much as a kind of modernist, sort of existentialist, my conscience call of conscience. So then you're saying no, it's a public sense of belonging to the conscience of a society or collective. That's so interesting.
Yeah, and Milton, sorry, now I became greedy. So so what Milton says, this thing in the Apology in Spectimnus, that he says, I'm not my own self, but was incorporated into the truth where I was persuaded. And what he means by this is that he becomes one and in a body of the people that he was writing with, that there's not his singular identity, rather he becomes the identity of the political position. And I think that this is a really radical challenge to every sense of the political spectrum, right? Yeah. That incorporation is about what you choose, the kind of the politics that you choose, the activity of writing and of working with people collaboratively to engage in that and to address the society more wholly. And I think that was what underpinned them. And in any sense of a kind of, I do believe that it's limiting to think about, to sort of stamp out all of this material with a kind of modern idea of what a conscience might be, or even what a Christianity might be. Today, I think that this is a much more radical moment, and there's this one.
It has something to teach us to think of conscience not as a kind of solipsistic or self-indulgence, but actually a conscience that includes others, it's quite important to think about what you're saying, not to think about it in the modernist way, which is also just another conception. It's not our truth. It's not that 1644 is incorrect and 1938 or 2025 is correct. They're just different ways of thinking about some things we haven't really resolved. So I like this thinking, not that Milton is this old text that has been superseded, but say the other ones are also choices we make to think of conscience the way I did too much in a kind of existentialist, modernist way.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that's really important to the political pamphleteers of this moment, is to think what is inside of them. So in a moment of great political media change, so you have this is the moment where the printing press affects politics in a really major way in England for the first time. But you have this, so that you have all of these pressures, and then you have the medial pressure, sort of changes in technology pressure, but then you also have the changes in politics. And there's a real investigation of what's inside of the self. So George Wither, who's the author of The Speech Without Door, he says that he often has to, because of the pressures of pamphleteering, he has to escape inside of himself. And you might think that, but when he looks inside, you might think that he finds a kind of certain political position or something like that, which he's trying to articulate. But instead, he finds a wide open space, and he finds a sort of sublime open space within him. And Milton takes this up in his own poetry, but I think inside of Milton is not this wide open space. There's just many voices. There's all of there's all of these other voices. And we can see that sort of continuing in 17th century poetry, like in Andrew Marvell, in an argument against Andrew Marvell, one of his adversaries says this line, and I've had a few arguments with people about this line, that he says that there's many, as a critique of Marvell, he says there's many Miltons inside of Marvell. And I used this line in a conference paper about much of this material once, and this very senior scholar came up to me and he said, you really shouldn't use that line because it's homophobic. And I was like, that it's about sex. And I was like, what? And surely it's that Marvell was Milton's secretary, but it's also surely it has a sort of sexual connotation, but it's also incredibly political. It's about the Milton that continues on in Marvell as his teacher. But I love the weirdness of the phrase, there are many Miltons. So this would suggest to me that there are many Miltons inside of Milton. And it really articulates very beautifully this idea of what it means to speak for the body politic, is it to be within your own voice, the voicing of, the voicing of many people. And we said, and what I love about this most though is that you have a really beautiful delivery of both Milton and Marvell's political positions, but in the voice of the adversary, right? So that they're saying as a critique, there are many Miltons inside of you, when in fact there were many Miltons inside of Marvell. If we're to, believe, recent scholarship, there's Miltons all over the place. That's part of the promise of the work.
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. There are many Miltons, probably many Miltons inside of us that we don't know. So I'm really happy, Ruby, that you kind of allowed me to get some access to the many Miltons inside of us, probably. So I think so I just want to repeat, you're currently John Emmerson Fellow at the State Library of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia. You published an article on the Speech Without Doors in the Journal of the History of Ideas, and that'll be a book. So, we'll see that gets published, because this is a vitally important topic. And I love the way you connected this short, Areopagitica argument to the greater part, which to me also resonates a bit more, of Milton the poet. Actually, to me, there's a kind of different importance to that than the political pamphlet at the moment, but you sort of were able to really beautiful. I really love this conversation. It's a long podcast. I love that. It's in the nature and spirit of free speech. So for our listeners, this was Ruby Lowe, and I'll put the article, the Speech Without Doors, into the show notes. And there's a couple other episodes. I've had Stanley Fish on the show. But you are my first Milton scholar, so I'm really grateful that you took the time to be with me on this podcast from Australia today.
Thank you. It was wonderful.